Good afternoon. My name is Maria Durden. I'm a partner at Simpson Weigel Law and the chair of the Condo Practice Group. I'm also the past president of the Golden Horseshoe chapter of CCI. CondoTalk was created to provide free, short, informative, and practical solution-based webinars to condo owners, directors, managers, and those servicing the condo industry and community. Thank you for joining this afternoon's CondoTalk webinar, Going Electric, Condos and Car Chargers. Today, we will be reviewing the legal requirements relating to the installation of EVCSs, electric vehicle charging stations, discussing how to best ensure the success of this type of project at your condo, and reviewing the technical requirements and considerations when installing an EVCS. We have three excellent speakers with us today. Please see the chat area for a link to each speaker's full bio. Patricia Elia. Patricia is a condo lawyer with Elia Associates, a firm that provides a full range of legal services to condos throughout Ontario. Patricia is heavily involved with CCI, including with the Huronia chapter, National Council, and National Executive. Welcome, Patricia. Michelle Joy. Michelle is the Executive Director of Condo Management at Wilson Blanchard. She holds her RCM and is a General License Manager with the CMRAO. She has been in the condo industry for over 8 years and has experience working with all types of condos. She is a frequent CondoTalk speaker, as well as other CCI educational sessions. Welcome, Michelle. And last but not least, we have Manny Alter. Manny is the Director of Business Development at EV Direct. Manny is responsible for sales and business strategies and has developed the multi-stage sales techniques for effectively reaching condos, managers, and boards. Manny works tirelessly to build strong working relationships with a multitude of players within the EV industry and has created a huge presence for EV Direct. Welcome, Manny. I would also like to thank our sponsor who enables us to provide CondoTalk free of charge and therefore easily accessible to the condo community. Please note that the link to our sponsor website is available in the chat feature on this webinar. Our sponsor for today's webinar is Elia Associates Condominium Lawyers. Thank you so much, Patricia. We are going to dive right in. We have an hour, which will inevitably fly by. So we will start off with Patricia, who will give us some background as to the legal requirements for EVCS. Patricia?
Thanks very much, Maria, and thanks for having me. So in terms of the Condominium Act requirements, we know that the Condominium Act was changed, and I know a lot of you have delved deeper into these regulations. So I'm going to give you a quick overview, and then I'm going to talk just briefly about funding. So basically, if we are going to implement EV charging, we would look to Section 97 and 98 of the Act. And what the government did through the regulation 4801 was modify those requirements. So basically, EV regulations exempt a condominium corporation from having to comply with Section 97 of the Act as long as the installation of the EVCS is carried out in accordance with the regulation. 24.3 sub 1 of the regulation stipulate that installation in relation to electric vehicle charging systems means any of the following is necessary to set up the EVCS: addition, alteration, or improvement to the common elements, or any changes in the assets of the corporation, or a change in service that the corporation provides to owners. So where the installation of an EVCS is made by the corporation, you can do it two ways: on notice, but without a vote of the owners, and enhanced notice to unit owners with a possible vote. So notice, but no vote is required, has definitive thresholds similar to what you're seeing in 97 of the Act. And basically, it has to be less than 10% of the annual budget of the common expenses for the current fiscal year, irrespective of whether the money is going to be spent in the year or not. In the reasonable opinion of the board, so the board needs to do its due diligence in accordance with Section 37. The owners would not regard the proposed installation as causing a material reduction or elimination of their use or enjoyment of the units that they own or the common elements or assets, if any, of the corporation. So that's important. And I think we're seeing that reflected in market values improving when you see EVCS as an option. 3, we're looking at the condominium corporation providing notice to the owner that contains the information I've told you about before, a description of the proposed installation, and all other information relating to the proposed installation. That a bylaw of the corporation requires to be included in the notice. So this is important to think about if you're reviewing your bylaws or revising them. Think about whether or not your operating bylaw needs to be enhanced by dealing with EV charging. And you've also given notice for a prescribed period of time. Alternatively, we also have enhanced notice and a possible vote, and the corporation must send a notice to the owners where it is greater than 10% of the annual budgeted common expenses, that is the proposed cost, or the proposed installation may cause a material reduction or elimination of the owner's use or enjoyment. Again, due diligence to support those views is important for the board before you go into that kind of dynamic. And in these cases, you can determine, unit owners can accept the notice or they can requisition a meeting to have a vote. So then we also have allocation of the costs where the EVCS is installed by the condominium corporation. And the corporation takes on the responsibility of getting the work done, but it becomes a common expense cost. Just so you know, the regulation does provide for that under 24.3. We also have the Section 98 equivalent of under the regulation where the installation of the EVCS is proposed by the unit owner. A unit owner may ask to install the EVCS on the general common elements, i.e. in visitor spaces that are not unitized, in exclusive use common elements, or even in a parking unit, which is a unitized space. But they require electrical wiring to be run through or along the common elements of the corporation. The requesting unit owners is exempt. They say exempt from having to comply with Section 98 as long as the installation is carried out in accordance with the EV reg. But if you really look carefully at that, at the agreement that's proposed, what you will find is there are very common elements to what you see in Section 98. And the idea is you have to appreciate what Section 98 is doing. It's trying to allocate responsibility for the modifications that are being made. So in the process of the application, the unit owner must make the application in accordance with the requirements of the Act in writing, address for service. All these things are prescribed. And then the board can approve the response, the application, reject the application, or it requires that the proposed EVCS installation be carried out in an alternative manner or location. So the board does have input. And when can a board reject an application? That's the question a lot of people like to know. The board may only reject the unit owner's application to install an EVCS based on the opinion or report of a qualified professional whose profession lends credibility to the report or the opinion, and under one of the following circumstances. The installation of the EVCS would be in violation of the Condominium Act, its regulations, or any other act, including the Electrical Safety Code. The installation of the EVCS would adversely affect the structural integrity of the building, or the installation of the EVCS would pose a serious risk to health and safety of an individual or damage of property or the assets of a condominium. So I think it's important to think about this because it may be applicable in some older condos. We are now coming up to condos that are 50 years old because the first condo in Ontario was built in 1968 and registered. So we need to think about the viability of structural change to the extent that it's required to accommodate. So what we are thinking is we need to also have a plan, and boards need to think about what their capacity is and how to deal with these issues. I'm sure we're going to get further into this. I just want to touch briefly on, if the agreement is reached between the parties, um, then we need to talk about the Section 24 agreement. And what we cover there is the manner of installation of the EVCS, allocation of the costs of the EVCS as between the condominium corporation and the unit owners, and the duties and responsibilities of the condominium corporation and the unit owner with respect to the EVS, including cost of use, operation, repair after damage, maintenance, and insurance, and the cost of preparing the Section 24 agreement. We also need to specify who will have ownership of the EVCS or any part of it. And there is a technical definition of an EVCS, and you can get a copy of that definition through the Electrical Safety Code. You can't get the updated version for free. You have to pay for that, but they will give you a slightly older version for free. If you just say to them, I am a taxpayer and I do pay my taxes, so could you please send me a copy? And then we also talk about regarding the cessation of use and operation of the EVCS or termination of the Section 24 agreement and when that will happen. After the owner and condominium sign the Section 24 agreement, the condominium corporation must register it against the unit owner's title. So it's very similar to that 98 process and the things we think about. So I'm going to leave it there, except I'm going to talk just for a moment about funding. How can you do it? As I said, the cost of the installation can be passed on to unit owners as a common expense. You can do a special assessment. You can do a borrowing bylaw to support a loan. You also can hire a service provider these days that will maybe pay the cost of the installation and that you will pay for that service and the recapture of that cost over time. It's almost like a lease to purchase at the end of the day. But I'm sure we'll hear some more options later on as we talk to our other speakers. Thanks, Maria.
Thanks, Patricia. We just have a couple questions, if you wouldn't mind if I
Sure.
direct this to you and we can maybe discuss them. What are the board's obligations with respect to providing charging stations to residents? That's something that we often get asked as corporations legal counsel is, maybe we have one or two owners saying, I'm getting a electric vehicle, please accommodate me. Does the corporation have to accommodate the individual, or what are their legal obligations versus what are some recommendations?
Well, I think that generally, every case is different, and especially depends on the type of building and the age. But I will say this, generally, yes, you have to accommodate that request. The way that the policies and the legislation are driving us, no pun intended, is to go electric vehicles and allow for that integration into society, especially if we've got targets to hit by 2030. So, I don't think you can say no unless you've got a qualified professional opinion saying this is not a good idea for the reasons I did note. There's a challenge to the safety, structural integrity, something like that. But other than that, I think, we should all be proactive, think about it coming, and get the necessary engineering professional reports before you get the request. So you know what your capacity is to accommodate people in advance.
Mm-hmm. And does an owner have more right to request an accommodation for an EVCS over a renter?
Well, renters don't have the same rights as owners. We don't really contemplate their requests under the Condo Act. We will only deal with the property owner. So it's the unit owner that must be supporting the renter and further the application.
Thank you so much, Patricia.
No problem.
Michelle, we're going to head over to you now and see if you have some management tips and maybe some more stories from your end on EVCSs.
Excellent. Thanks, Maria. Yes, I'm going to do my best to give some management tips, and I definitely have some personal experience as well. But from the management side of things, and I see some of my colleagues in the participant list today, and I think we can all attest that we're all still kind of learning our way through this process. So I'm going to do my best to give the tips, but I can say as of right now, I haven't even personally successfully completed from start to finish because there's so much that takes into consideration. But I will share what I've learned to date, and hopefully that will help others in their own condominiums. So just based on my experience, I'm going to start off, and I can see just from the questions submitted in advance that most of our attendees seem to be coming from buildings. So low-rise, high-rise, multi-residential buildings, because it's not as much of a challenge in townhouse sites. The reason being is that often in townhouse sites, there's usually a garage. You're usually individually metered for your hydro. You're not going through multi-level parking garages, running everything from an electrical room on P3 to P1. So it's a little bit different of a process. Now, I will say I've talked to some managers where they have a townhouse site that might have just an above ground parking lot. They don't have garages, they have maybe a community parking area. So in that case, you would have to determine, speak with your professionals, whether it's an engineer, an electrician, to determine what type of infrastructure is available, much like you would in a parking garage. There are EV, I'm sure everybody's driven around and seen the charging stations at malls, gas stations, businesses. So there's EV charging stations that are completely safe outside. You don't have to worry about, inclement weather. So that is a solution. Again, you just have to work with your professionals to determine, how to run the electrical to the parking spots and how they're going to be installed with the owners. But oftentimes it's much easier in townhouses because of, individual driveways and garages and separately metered hydro to each unit. So where we really see more of the challenge, like I said, is in multi-residential buildings, high-rise, low-rise buildings. So my first experience with EV charging was downtown Burlington. I've managed a few buildings right downtown Burlington, where, as we can all appreciate, if you manage in a downtown setting, land, parking space is limited. So in those settings, we had buildings with deeded parking spaces only. There was no visitor parking. There was no exclusive use parking. It was just deeded parking spaces. So that's where I find the biggest challenge comes in for boards. When you have multi-level garages and only so many electrical rooms, first thing is some owners may be paying a higher cost than others to get the electricity to their parking spot. It all depends on where your parking spot is in respect to the electrical room. And it's not as easy as just swapping spots. Now, certainly they could transfer the deed of their parking spaces, but I'm sure the lawyers can attest to the fact that that doesn't happen all that often. People are usually pretty happy about the parking space that they got. And if you're looking for a transfer, usually you probably have a less desirable parking space than the one you're going after. Again, no visitor parking. So there's not an option at some buildings to have a community charging area. So where you can install a couple charging stations that owners and visitors could use at the same time. That's just not an option to some. So the only option is running it directly to the individual unit owner parking spaces. So the other downside to that potentially could be if an owner has a parking spot in the garage and the only option is to charge outside. I mean, if they're desperate, they're probably gonna go ahead with that. But given we live in a multi-seasonal climate here in Canada, if they have an indoor parking space, they're probably going to want to maintain their car inside and not have to charge an outdoor parking. And then there's what I refer to as your infrastructure upgrade, or what your capacity currently is and what you need to do potentially for a retrofit to maximize the number of charging stations. So my first tip for boards whenever we start to look at EV charging is to have an assessment done of your current electrical capabilities of your building. What does the current supply usage allow? How many charging stations does that allow to start you off with? Sometimes you'll have the ability to do additional upgrades to your main electrical panel to allow for additional charging, but there will also be a capacity cutoff because there's only so much that your utility supplier is supplying to the building. So my first recommendation for boards when they bring up EV charging with me is let's bring someone in who can do an assessment, let us know what our current capacity is, and do we have room for future capacity? If so, what do we need to do to get to that step? That gives you kind of your base. So maybe as of right now, you can accommodate 10 charging stations, but you might have a 100-unit building. So what I see a lot of boards doing is they want to try and maximize it. So that's where the professionals come in to give you that advice, because your property manager, I mean, I'm certainly not qualified to do that. And a lot of us aren't. You want to bring in the trained professionals. Just checking my notes here. Another way, and I'm sure Manny will get into this because he's our EV technical guy today to talk about all the technical aspects of things, is energy management as well. So I know in our pre-chat, he was talking about, how we charge overnight. A lot of people charge overnight, and, in most units, I'd assume that most people are sleeping. You're not running your dishwasher, you're not maybe watching TV, all your lights aren't on. So the demands of your power supply. So energy management is another great tool that I always encourage boards to look at to maximize the usage within their parking garages. And again, consult your professionals. They'll be able to give you, there's different I like to call them turnkey solutions, but different EV service providers that offer different ways for energy management and for charging stations. So I always recommend meeting with a couple different service providers to get an idea of what solution might fit best for your community. Once we get to this stage, so you've done your assessment, you're meeting with different service providers, they're telling you the different solutions, you get the quote for your retrofit upgrade, and this is usually the point where the board gets overwhelmed because it's a lot. It is a lot, and it's all new to us, and they stop. This is why I personally haven't seen a project all the way through yet, because I think it's very, it can be intimidating to some. It's a very technical thing we're doing. So I think more EV charging companies are entering the market than there were obviously a few years ago. And they're offering, like I said, what I call a turnkey solution. So they're coming in, they're doing the assessments. They have an electrician that they work with that can help you with the retrofitting of your, electrical system if needed. They have the person who's going to install the EV charging systems. They supply the EV charging systems. They supply an energy management system. So are they almost like sub-metering, like you would do with utilities? Are they, charging the fee to the users of the EV charger, then collecting that and then reimbursing the corporation for the use of the hydro? Because a lot of the time you're not sub-metering every single charging station on a different hydro bill. So that's I think the variety has grown over the last few years. I'm seeing more and more companies come up that are doing this type of work. But I think the cost is a big one, and Patricia touched on some different options for financing these costs, and that's a question we get a lot, because I'm seeing at a minimum $15,000 to $20,000 easily, and upwards, depending on the building you have, maybe upwards of $100,000 depending on the work needed. But I'm saying at a minimum probably $15,000 to $20,000 for this electrical work. So obviously Patricia mentioned loans, special assessment, common expenses. I know that a corporation I'm working with right now, we've done the assessment, we've met with our various partners to find what solution is good for us. We've kind of narrowed down our choice. What we're at right now is, and Manny, I'm going to leave Manny to talk about this, but it's funding. There are some funding options out there as well to help alleviate the cost of this. So we're at the process where we're waiting to hear back about a potential funding option. And once that funding option comes in, we'll know the exact, have a better idea of what the cost is going to be to implement our plan. And so what we plan to do at that stage is send a notice out to owners saying, we're investigating EV charging. We know that this is obviously something that's coming and going to be popular. At this building in particular, we've already had several requests, and we have some electric vehicles in our garage already. We're going to basically say, this is going to be the cost, and we're going to actually include some of the retrofitting cost as part of your purchase price of your EV charger. So you're going to pay for your charging station, but you also have the opportunity to buy in to get a guaranteed spot by helping contribute to the cost of the upgrades to the building as well. So by that, we're hoping to get a good idea of what the actual engagement will be and how many charging stations we need to start with. So that's the spot I'm at in a current project right now. But I think gauging the interest of your owners is a big one, finding out how many spaces are going to be available. And again, I think that's going to be constantly changing. People were so against EV vehicles. There was very minimal out on the market that you could buy a few years ago. More and more are coming out. The price of gas is over $2 a liter. People are going to be looking for alternatives. So somebody who might not be interested today may be interested 6 months to a year from now. So I think that that's going to continuously change as well. So the other point is, depending on the demographic of your building, you might get some pushback. There are buildings that are constructed to be green buildings. So people are very interested in the aspect that it is energy efficient. So if you say, we're going to bring in EV charging now to continue to be a green, energy efficient building, if owners bought knowing that from the beginning, you might have more engagement. If you're a 50-year-old condo that needs a ton of retrofit costs to bring you up to speed, and maybe you have a much older demographic that's not, as up to date on technology and they like the old ways of doing things, you might get some pushback from owners. It might be harder to go through that process. So some of kind of my takeaways are always ensure that you consult with the corporation's lawyer and follow the requirements under the Act. So Patricia touched on Section 97, Section 98, when you can deny. So Another great resource I find is the CAO has a page dedicated to electric vehicles as well. So any owner that inquires, I always like to recommend that to them. It gives you kind of the step-by-step and does cover, but obviously always seeking an opinion from the corporation's lawyer is your best route. Have the board investigate multiple options for charging station systems for monitoring and collecting costs and energy management. It's not a one size fits all. Find out which solution works best for you. And then one big thing that I think there was a question Maria asked Patricia at the beginning was how, do you have to, what is the requirements for a corporation? And Patricia said, be proactive. And the reason you want to consider that is going back to maximizing the number of spaces in your garage. So what you don't want to happen is allowing random chargers throughout your parking garage, all on different systems, or you don't want someone going in and installing a Tesla supercharger that's going to draw more from your electrical supply than a level 2 charger from any given brand. So having a plan, being proactive and having a plan in place of how many chargers you can have, how can you maximize it? What system should we have? How are we going to collect the money? Because another thing as a board you want to check is most management agreements nowadays have a clause that your property manager or your management company is not going to handle utility metering. So I've seen EV installs where all they do is put a check meter on the charging station. So it's not an actual, hydrometer. It's what we call a check meter. And someone's expected to go look at that on a monthly basis and then reconcile the costs and charge back the owner for electricity. A lot of management agreements say that your management company is not going to do that for you. So who's going to do that? So make sure that you're looking into that, but also just having that proactive plan in place so that when someone does come and say, I want to install an EV charging station, you can come back and say, here's the program that we use at our building. This is what you're permitted to install. And you kind of have more control over what's going on in your parking garage or what's going on in your parking lot, and being able to really maximize the use of the electricity and the EV charging within your building. So I know a lot of boards, because this is a lot, kind of want to put their head in the sand and say like, we'll just deal with it when someone requests it. But being proactive is a really great tip to take away from all of this, or at least start exploring your options. So those are my management tips. I know I talked really fast, but hopefully there was some good tips for takeaway in there.
That's fantastic, Michelle. You said a lot of really, really good stuff. So I think the one thing that certainly rings true is being proactive. So maybe you've had 1 or 2 owners of 200 ask at this point, but the question is going to come up more often than not in the future. So being proactive and maybe having that engineer for the corporation investigate what are the capabilities going forward and where are those costs, because there are owners who are going to say, I'm not interested, I don't want anything to do with it, but the board has to. Let's all remember, act honestly and in good faith and how a reasonable board would act in accordance with Section 37 of the Condominium Act. So what does that mean? That means you investigate, you ask the right questions. Doesn't mean you have a yes or no answer right now to the installation, but at least they put your mind to it. So always remember that as a board. Have you done your due diligence? Have you looked into the issue? The other thing I'd like to add is Michelle said, you're right, a lot of managers won't and shouldn't, respectfully, be the ones checking these usage components to see how much electricity has been used by an individual for charging their vehicle. So that means you will have a company, or the corporation will hire a company to do that on behalf of the corporation or the owners or whatever the setup is. If you do that, though, you have to remember that they do need to have access to the common elements and maybe the units if they're unitized parking spaces, which may require an easement bylaw as well. So there's a lot of questions here. It comes down to, where is it being installed? On what is it being installed? What kind of access is being required? So as Michelle said, do have your corporation's legal counsel, because each condo is not the same, unfortunately, in that regard. So Manny, you are the man of the hour. Tell us, what is the solution to all this?
Maria, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining and taking the time to listen. So I'm going to spend the next 10 to 15 minutes just going through the basics of EV charging. I think two of the biggest misconceptions in the industry is, number one, that it is very complicated and daunting to put EV charging in condos, and it really isn't. And the second misconception is focusing on charging and not on power. So hopefully by the end of the 10 to 15 minute presentation, that'll be a little bit clearer. Basic EV infrastructure in a condo consists of a dedicated EV panel, pipe and wire to a parking spot, and a charging station at the end of the line. When we talk about EV infrastructure, we're talking about building-wide systems. So some of this was brought up earlier, and essentially there's three options for a condo. There's what we call single run, which allows an owner to run their own pipe and wire from the condo's electrical room. Then you get into issues of the limited power, issues of how is it being metered, and it's really not a great solution for the long term for the condo. The second option is communal charging, and this is really where the industry is a little bit divided. Our position on communal charging is, if you're a condo looking for EV charging for owners, not for visitors, but for owners, communal charging is the most expensive way to give you the least amount of charging and the most amount of headache. As more and more people get EV vehicles or purchase EV vehicles, the only
Manny, you frozen. I'm not sure if you have to do something from your end. Okay, I'm not sure. We've lost Manny for right now. His electrical mic on out, pardon the pun. He's still frozen. So while Manny stays in his current state and we have some technical difficulties, I will ask some questions. So please bear with us, and I apologize for this. I know it's been a kind of talked about a couple times, raised, but I'm not sure if it's been clearly answered. So because it's been asked through the Q&A, and I want to encourage everyone, go into the Q&A. There are answers in there to at least 10 questions right now. Valuable information for everyone. So make sure you're going in there, even just reading the answers. But how about the payment for the EVCS? Okay, so you don't have an EVCS, the corporation is going to install it on the common elements. How can it be paid for? So let's just maybe, oh, hold on a second. Manny's back, he's back. We will go back to payment of EVCS after Manny continues. Go ahead, Manny.
So sorry about that. I apologize.
No problem.
So just jumping right back into it. The only way to essentially have these EVCSs or these EVs charge efficiently is within their own parking spot with their own power. As we said, basic EV infrastructure consists of dedicating a panel, so taking power from the condo's electrical, putting it into a dedicated EV panel, running pipe and wire to people's parking spots, and having a charger at the end of the line. It's straightforward, simple, easy. That is how everyone is going to present their approach to you. It is more the limitations within the condo that complicate things, and making sure you understand your limitations and how you're going to deal with it in the future is what is the complicated part of this process. Well, what are the limitations in the condo? The first limitation, and the biggest one, is power. There will never be enough power to accommodate everyone in the condo, and you don't need power to accommodate everyone. At the end of the day, the average EV driver is charging 1 to 3 hours per night. In the worst case scenario, does not need more than 4 to 6 hours. So why would I give one owner 100% of power 100% of the time when that power is going to sit idle for 18 to 22 hours out of the day? And that may mean that the condo will run out of power. Power management systems and systems that share power are extremely important for the future of EV in your condo. The last thing you want to do as a corporation is have to go back to your utility and say, hey, we want more power. That is something that can potentially cost $1 million to $2 million, and we want to stay away from that. We believe that most condos, and our company personally has looked at probably close to 3,000 to 4,000 condos in the last 5 years across Canada, and only maybe 2 to 3 times have we seen that condos just don't have enough power. There is enough power within the building. It's how you efficiently deliver that power. So power management is extremely important. The second limitation in the condo is billing. So this becomes a big one because we are coming off the condo's main electrical room. How do we set this up in a way where tracking, monitoring, and billing for the energy used doesn't become a burden for the property management and the board, so it can be done seamlessly? And on the flip side, how is it done in a way where the fees to be collected are not, the management fees are not higher than the actual fees? So the average that we're seeing is owners using between $10 to $25 of energy used. The feedback from owners is, why are we being billed 15, 20, 30 bucks a month on top of that for management? So knowing how the system is going to track, monitor, and bill the owners is also extremely important. The last limitation, and this was touched upon by, I think, Patricia, no, it was Michelle who touched upon it, is there are easier condos and there are more difficult condos. Easier condos are townhomes, condos that you can move vehicles around. In that case, the infrastructure is not so important. Everyone has their dedicated spot. Everyone has their dedicated power. It becomes easy. But in a high rise or a mid rise where there's 50, 60, 200, 1,000 parking spots, and you now have to implement these EV panels, how is it done in a way where you're not left with a web of piping in the ceiling, and you're not left with some owners paying a large amount and some owners paying a small amount? So design of EV infrastructure is also extremely important. The industry essentially came up with smart charging. And the way that happens is, and we'll take that example of 10, if your condo only had the power for 10 EVs, on day one, what you're going to do is you're going to take a dedicated panel, run pipe and wire, and put a charging station. Somewhere along that line, the system needs a brain. You can either put the brain at the end of the line in the charging station, or you could put the brain at the beginning of the line in the electrical panel. Our company personally likes putting it at the beginning of the line, and I'm not going to get into the differences between the two, but essentially, when you have an issue, you need a solution. And the issue here is not charging stations. No one comes to a condo and says, how do I charge my vehicle? Rather, the issue here is power. And the only thing we believe the condos should focus on is the delivery of that power and being efficient with that delivery. Condos are not in the game of telling people how to toast their bread or watch their TV. Why would you want to get into the game of, here's a charging station you need to use, especially when the way we charge our vehicles will look different in a very short period of time, where the way we deliver power will not. So our recommendations are as follows. Take that power of 10, feed it into a panel that has a brain. That panel can now on day one accommodate 20. So the ratio is now 2 to 1. And it's based on worst case scenario. If all 20 people came home at 6 p.m. and all 20 people had to leave by 5 a.m. and all 20 people drove in from, Kitchener or Ottawa and all had a, quarter battery, there's still enough time and power throughout the evening to fully charge those vehicles. And essentially, you've dealt with issue number one, which is power, which is you've taken the power of 10, you've doubled it to 20. So condos will say, what do we do when number 21 comes? Well, because you've started with a smart system, you'll have a number of options at hand. Number one, you could start diluting power even further. So you can go to a 3 to 1 or a 4 to 1 ratio, and you'll be able to do that with data on hand. To do that on day one, just because some guy Manny on a Zoom in 2022 said that the average EV driver charges for 1 to 3 hours, it could be that your condo has a lot of people that commute. So wait till number 21 comes, only 2x that power, and then look at that 1 or 2 or 3 years of data and say, okay, we have all those 20 owners' data. Can we now dilute power even further based on their driving habits? What you'll find is probably that you can. But there are other technologies in the market that will allow us to tap into the condo's energy that may not have been there on day one. And that is, when people charge their vehicle at night, let's take the power from the building. That requires additional hardware where we're now talking to the back and forth to the condo's main electrical. But by starting with a smart system, it allows the condo to expand down the road. So that's the power implementation. Our recommendations to condos is, depending on the size of your condo, one panel may not be enough. You may need 2 or 3 panels. Companies like ourselves can help and show you what the recommendations are in terms of that. And then in terms of billing, again, make sure you fully understand what the billing options are. And as Michelle pointed out, there isn't only one way of doing things. There are multiple ways of doing things. The recommendation on day one is not go through this process, and when you get to the end of the process, spend the $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. It's EV is coming. Let's spend the time now to understand our needs, our limitations, our requirements. Let's put together an EV package, because I can tell you, these processes can take anywhere between 4 to 6 or even 12 months to put together. And the last thing you want to do as a condominium is have to run through this process and come up with a solution that may or may not work for the corporation. I'll just touch upon 2 or 3 more points, and I'll turn it back over to you, Maria. In terms of funding, there is a lot of funding out there. Our recommendation is, unfortunately, there's a lot of condos that go for funding and then base their EV infrastructure around that funding. That is a very big mistake we see in the industry. Just because you're going to save $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, $50,000, and I'm not minimizing that, to come up with an EV policy that doesn't work for you and get a 50% discount on that is the wrong way of going things. Understand your needs, understand the solution that works for you, and then see if, based on that policy that you've put together, there is funding available, then go for that funding. In terms of cost, just to give you an idea, for every 20-person system, and it's really regardless of the solutions that you're looking at a starting implementation point of, let's call it on the high end, around $30,000 to $40,000. That is the investment from the corporation. The corporation now will have 1 or 2 of these hubs for owners to tap into. Some corporations will cover that cost. Most corporations we're dealing with say, hey, if it's a 20-person system and it costs us on the high end $40,000, that's a $2,000 cost, or a 1/20th fee, back to each of the owners, which, number one, allows the corporation to recoup their investment at 100% once 20 people tap in. It allows owners in the building who would never have thought of EV to buy in as an investment, so they don't have to run pipe and wire and charging stations and fees. They just have to buy into this infrastructure, and now they can put that on title. The more owners that buy in, the better the condo can equip itself and say, okay, we have 30 or 40 owners who are willing to buy in on day one. It's easier on the design side now to go out and design infrastructure rather than 1 or 2 people buying in. The full costs are around $4,000 to $6,000. So for an owner to buy in a 1/20th piece, run pipe and wire to their parking spot, and put a charging station, really regardless of how this is set up, and if it's set up in a proper way, you're looking at around $4,000 to $6,000. If it's much cheaper than 4, you're probably not getting something that you need. If it's more expensive than 6, it's either a poor design or you are overpaying for EV infrastructure. So $4,000 to $6,000 is essentially the cost. So just to wrap it up, understanding your limitations, understanding your needs, being proactive, which I think is a common theme throughout this webinar, being proactive and going through this process and speaking to professionals and getting multiple quotes and understanding what your options are is extremely important. Thank you, Maria.
Wonderful, Manny. That's fantastic news. It's great to get some kind of estimates and quotes, what you're seeing out there, and going rates as of 2022, because we always know, who knows what's going to happen next year. But we do have a couple questions that came your way, if you're okay in answering them. The first is, with respect to future reserve fund studies, once installed, do you have an idea of the average life cycle for the equipment and future replacement costs? Can we assume partial system renewal or needed over time? So how often do you have to replace these systems once they've been installed?
That's a great question. So taking our approach, which is the electrical panel, that is the only investment the condo needs to make. All the appliances down the line, think of it like a TV. The condo has cable in the condo. Every owner buys their own TV, upgrades their own TV to 8K, 5K, we don't care as a corporation, and maintains their appliance at the end of the line. A electrical panel has 3 components. The electrical components, these are things that we've been in condos that haven't touched their electrical in 40 years. Those things, the bus bars, the panels, those things typically last for 40, 50 years, even if they're not maintained. The second component are the dedicated breakers within the panel. Just dealing with condo lawyers and going through this process hundreds of times with condos, to me, that's an easy one. If breaker 4 belongs to Maria and breaker 4 stops working, that is a cost to the owner. The real issue here is the software running the panel, and that is the brain of the system. And that is something the condo will have to maintain and upgrade as time goes on. Our recommendation to condos is in a 10-year period. We typically see between year 8 and 12 those PLC issues happening. The cost is between $1,000 to $3,000. So the recommendation is for condos to budget on the high end around $3,000 over a 10-year period.
Wonderful. More your way, and this, as well as the other panel members, if they know the answer to this one, are you aware of any federal grants for EV charging stations at this time?
Yes, so there is an NRCan ZEVIP grant, and you can Google that. It's NRCAN ZEVIP. You can read about it. It's open to really anyone in Canada in multi-res or MERB, and there are many companies out there that can help you apply for those. Just keep your expectations in check. They are heavily applied for, and there is minimal funding.
Thank you for that. Here's another one. Should the load evaluation and the electrical work required to implement an EVCS be done by the condos? This is regular, not to diminish those regular engineers, or an electrical contractor, since they are aware of the setup and specific quirks of the building's existing electrical system and are aware of the impact on the general condo electrical system? Or does it need to be done by someone who specializes in EVCS? If it is someone who specializes in EVCS, like perhaps Mr. Manny, to what degree should the condo's regular, they took away the quotes, engineer and electrical contractor be involved?
That is a great question. So one of the things I did leave out is the most important piece of all of this is that LOA. That load assessment is extremely important. The answer that I would give is it should be a reputable company. It doesn't need to be an engineer, a specified EV a company, or the electrician that is preferred in the building. In 30 seconds or less, a load assessment is very simple. Anyone can see the power coming into the building. Let's call it a 1 liter bottle of energy. The question the condo has is how much energy is available in the bottle? The question back to the condo is, well, how much energy is in the bottle already for us to determine how much power is available? A load assessment is a very simple process of saying, here's the power coming in. Here's a 12-month assessment of the most power you've ever used. And based on that, here is the available power. The only time you recommend paying big bucks for an engineering firm to come in is if there is a very limited amount of power based on these load assessments, then we would recommend an engineering firm. But I can tell you our company doesn't charge for load assessments. Others do. They shouldn't cost you more than $750 to $1,000 unless, again, you have very, very limited power after that initial assessment comes in.
Thank you, Manny. I think we have one more for you, and then I have a question I would like to just throw at the panel because it's been raised many times in the Q&A. And again, please, I encourage you, even if you don't have a question to ask, go into the Q&A and read the questions that have been asked and answered, because it's more information for you to gather. Manny, the 30 to 40K quoted for a 20-car hub covers EV panel, pipe/wire hardware for the condo. Then the end user needs to purchase charger for 4 to 6K. Is that correct? I think you're saying yes.
Yeah, so just to jump in. When I say 4 to 6K, it includes paying your corporation back the 120th. It's not on top of the $30,000 to $40,000 investment by the corporation.
Then he says, what do you see or recommend for electrical assessment, electrical contractors, legal and other costs? Okay, I don't, they're asking you what the estimate is for electrical and legal. I don't think, I'm not sure. Yeah, the answer is, which is
your condo lawyer.
Right, right, and it really just depends. But the question is, do you see economies of scale converting a building with 200 to 300 units, vehicles?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yes.
and the answer is so let's take it from a different angle. When a condo asks me what is the most efficient way from a cost and design perspective to implement EV infrastructure, the answer is always going to be at 100%. Now, that's not the recommendation. That is the answer to the question, what is the most efficient way of doing things? Because no one should be recommending 100%, and because therefore we're not doing it in the most efficient way, making sure that you're not putting in too little or too much EV infrastructure is extremely important. So here's the answer to your question. If I can only put in one EV system and you have 3 levels of parking, I need to find a central location on P2. I'll core up to P1 and down to P3 to accommodate the entire parking garage. 2 systems now allows me to divide the garage vertically in half, and now I can put a central panel on the east end and a central panel on the west end. 3 systems allow me, so on and so forth. It doesn't mean that the cost, the 1/20th, is going to be much more expensive than the 1/40th or 1/60th as you go. It means that the design efficiencies for the condo long term, and the amount of pipe that's in the ceiling, and the amount people need to pay to get to panels will be cheaper. Now, one of the things we just quickly we do with condos is we say, okay, what is the minimum that you need to get in? So if you had a 700-foot wide garage, we had a condo the other week that said, we want 4 panels. And the answer was, we can only find 3 central locations for you. So to put a 4th panel isn't going to add in the efficiencies, and you don't have more than 60 people on day one. So really understanding what the bare minimum is, what the recommended amount is, and are there efficiencies of scale beyond that is something that's customized for every single condo that you go to.
Excellent. So it's not even necessarily what is the answer, but what is the right question to ask. Yeah. And this is one of those circumstances where you don't know what you don't know until you've actually dealt with it. So here's a question for Patricia. In a townhouse where the garage is, let's say, part of the unit, so it's not a common element stall, should there be any rules or standards established if an owner would like to install their own EVCS within their garage?
Generally, yes, we would put in recommendations around how people should go about doing that, because we don't want people modifying even the units, maybe to the detriment of the common elements. And this happens when, we may see it as, isolated as a townhouse, but often there are common element components that we don't necessarily appreciate. So what we try to do is encourage the boards to think, be proactive, communicate to everybody, say, if you're thinking about this, let us know, and we can assess it to determine if there's going to be any modifications to the common elements. Because we have actually seen those exact circumstances where the boundaries of the unit, one would have thought they were enclosed completely, enclosing the garage completely, but they actually didn't. There were walls that were common element walls, and the drilling and the actual bringing of the power out to the garage to accommodate the charger required the cooperation of the condominium corporation. It's good just to know, and that's the thing. It's part of like, how many times do you have to do the due diligence? Do it once, depending on your community, and that you're not reinvesting every time somebody asks you a question.
Perfect. So, okay, this is the question I was kind of trying to fill in when Manny went rogue. Paying for a new EVS system versus maintaining and repairing one. Okay, this is probably the number one question. Reserve fund use. Okay, can the condo use the reserve fund to pay for a new system? I'll tell you what my 2 cents on this are, okay? So there's a proposal to the Condominium Act that reserve funds will be able to be used for, we'll call environmental incentives, make things more environmentally friendly, things like that. So once that section comes into force, it would be my opinion, if I were to be asked, that you could use the reserve fund. However, at this time, that section is not in force. It is still proposed. We don't know when that's going to come into law. Maybe never at the end of the day, but it's a proposal at this time. So right now, In general, I would say that if it's a new system, you've never had it before, you're going to install it as a condo, and then you cannot use the reserve fund. And the main purpose is this. If you use a reserve fund for a component you did not budget for, you're taking money away from another component you have budgeted for. The reserve fund is not your bank. It doesn't replenish miraculously without putting money into it. You save it according to a formula. So if you've never saved for an EVCS system, query, how can I use the money to build one? The short answer is you can't, but I do open the floor to my fellow panelists for their point of view on this.
Well, I would add to that. I agree with you completely, Maria, on that thinking. And I think when that section comes into force and effect, it will be very advantageous to condos. However, what I would add, though, as a caveat, because I keep thinking about aging condos that might be doing updating their existing capital assets, their electrical distribution system. So I think we also need to look at what is the electrical distribution system and what is the EVCS, right? And if the electrical distribution system needs to be made to be concurrent with modern standards, and part of that is expansion of capacity, then I actually do think there might be some room there in that existing system and its upgrading to modern day standards as part of the reserve fund plan to implement changes that are in the long term beneficial, right? Because you will also get that increased lifespan capacity upgraded asset. But it's also where it is in your reserve fund study and what the lifespan is of that actual component inventory.
I had an interesting take on this, which I know is not legal. I know, or the lawyers can tell me, but I was having this conversation with Patricia. So
sure, drag me into it. Go ahead.
No. You didn't necessarily agree with me. It was like a dialogue. I agree with Maria that the reserve fund is for existing components, major repair and replacement. One thing that I kind of thought of, and I think Patricia, you and I talked about how the government is kind of putting a little bit of an undue hardship on some of these older condos. Mm-hmm. So I thought about the exception to that provision that says if it's a code requirement, it can go through the reserve, even if it's not an existing component. Mm-hmm. So a big thing that I always go back to was when TSSA mandated car top rails in elevators. Everybody had to go and have the car top rails installed on their elevators. And because it was mandated code by TSSA, that could be a reserve expense. And I know same thing with certain fire code requirements as well. If it's a major cost, it's a change to the fire code. So the perspective I kind of took on this is we talked about earlier that to deny an owner access to an EV charging station is quite difficult. You have to basically have an expert say it's completely not feasible. So the government is saying we have to provide EV charging stations down to very minuscule limitations when we can say no. It's costly. So I kind of took the perspective because the government is mandating it. I know it's not a code requirement necessarily, but is that a gray area? I think I'm really reaching with it, but it was just a thought that I had at that point that you're really telling us we can't say no, and you're telling us we have to do this, and you're telling us this is the way the things we have to go, but we have to special assess our loan. We can't finance it through the reserve fund or save for it because it's not an existing component. I just thought that was an interesting perspective that I kind of came up with.
It is, Michelle, and I think that's the kind of discussion that is great to have, because it makes you to start thinking of what are the options. I would take it further, and this is where I get scared. Is okay, I get it. I know what you're saying. It kind of makes sense. But then that money I take out, where is it going to come from, right? Then your reserve fund is being depleted. So it's a very multifactorial question, right? And here's the other thing. Whatever you do, just make sure your auditor is on side, guys. Okay.
Yes.
Make sure whatever position you take, whatever legal opinion you rely on, your auditor gives you the go ahead as well, because if not, they will put it on your audited financial statements, and that will impact the value of your units, especially in resale with your status certificates. So lots of options, lots of factors. Just make sure your team, legal management, auditor, engineers, whomever is on side with what you decide to do, okay? Oh my goodness. I think what my favorite comment in the chat today was, I'm gonna shout out to Andrew Hall. This is really cool stuff and gets me excited for whatever reason. Thank you. That made me smile and like totally worth it, right? We could keep going forever. And a couple of people said, there's so much more. Can you summarize this? Can you put it in writing? Can you do something? The purpose of these condo talks aren't to give you legal advice or to walk away with a package that you can always refer to and rely on. It's to tell you what's out there, get you to start thinking, to start asking the right questions, like Manny said. That's half of the story, right? The other half is, as a board, to regroup, meet with your manager, discuss it, meet with your professional team and see what is best for me, for my corporation. But I'm sure everyone has very busy days. So I just want to say thank you so much to all the speakers, and thank you to the attendees for joining us this afternoon to discuss condos and car chargers. Our other upcoming courses and webinars are Intro to Condos on June 9th. We continue with the Enhanced Directors course, which started in April and runs through November. And then we have our first in-person condo conference, which is really exciting, on September 16th. And we really look forward to seeing all of you there. As always, we encourage and welcome your feedback, which we always review and try to incorporate suggestions into our webinars, whether it's about topics or format suggestions. We hope you enjoyed today's Condo Talk and look forward to you joining us again soon. Thank you to the speakers, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.